Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. What a betrayal the war in Afghanistan turned out to be. Above all, it was a betrayal of the American public, the people who for 20 years paid for the occupation. It was a betrayal of the ones who died there, of course, and of the tens of thousands of Americans who will carry the scars from this disaster for the rest of their lives. They were lied to. We were all lied to, and we have a right to feel bitter about that. But the war in Afghanistan was also, if we're going to be completely honest about it, a betrayal of the Afghan people. Our leaders made promises to them they knew they couldn't keep. Honorable countries don't do that. It's shameful. Imagine being an Afghan employee at Bagram Air Base. You woke up the other morning to find your American patrons gone. They didn't tell you they were leaving, they just left. So what happens to you now in a country run by the Taliban? It's hard to think about that. And yet tonight, many Americans are thinking about it, and they're feeling distressed as they do. Americans are kind people and generous. They are quicker and more eager to help strangers than anyone else in the world. We haven't seen polling on it, but we bet if you asked 100 people, should we try to help Afghans who are facing persecution for helping us, most Americans would say, of course we should. And we should be glad that they say that. You should be happy you live in a country where your neighbors love children and dogs and want to help refugees. We are generous and empathetic people, and we should be proud. Unfortunately, there are many in our ruling class who are anxious to take advantage of that, anxious to take advantage of our best qualities. They see our decency and our weakness, and they exploit those things, and they do it relentlessly. Let's try to save our loyal Afghan interpreters, we tell them. Perfect, they think. We'll open the borders and change the demographic balance of this country. Of course, that's exactly what they're doing right now on our southern border, naturally in the name of human rights and compassion. And they would like to do the very same thing with the disaster unfolding in Afghanistan, the disaster that they created. Watch this kid from MSNBC yesterday. Remember as you watch that he is regarded with total seriousness in Washington as a foreign policy expert, and that his fellow foreign policy experts wholeheartedly agree with him.
We're talking about
total seriousness in Washington as a foreign policy expert, and that his fellow foreign policy experts wholeheartedly agree with him.
We're talking about an evacuation of people who helped the wars, and that's an obligation of the United States, but it's sort of a moral floor that's functioning as a moral ceiling. The United States, the Biden administration, pardon me, isn't doing things necessary like increasing TPS access, letting in refugees by the millions to escape their certain fate at the hands of the Taliban.
So we must, quote, let in refugees by the millions, said the mustachioed foreign policy expert. The millions. Millions is not a handful of loyal Afghan interpreters. That's not even a fleet of cargo planes full of loyal Afghan interpreters. Millions is a good chunk of the entire population of Afghanistan, brought to our country at our expense to live in your neighborhood at the very moment our national fabric is fraying, in case you haven't noticed, and the United States is becoming unmistakably poorer. And that's not just one man's eccentric opinion on MSNBC, you should know. All the clever people are saying exactly the same thing. The U.S. should take as many Afghan refugees as it can, demands a recent headline in New York Magazine. As many refugees as we can? How many refugees is that? And is it really a good idea to do that for us? Don't ask. You're not allowed to ask that question because asking is racist. Watch.
The notion that their sort of horrific fear-mongering and racism doesn't carve out the men and women in Afghanistan who kept our soldiers alive for 2 decades is a new level of reprehensible.
So right-wing personalities using the crisis in Afghanistan to push an anti-refugee sentiment.
They're getting caught up in what I call the brown menace, which is this Trumper right-wing fear of people coming into the country from Central and South America. These people seem to be getting swept up into that xenophobia.
Stephen Miller's response to the collapse of Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul, the takeover of the Taliban was, look at Biden. He's trying to get brown people to come into the country. It's sickening and it's pathetic.
It's hilarious is what it is. The right wing hates brown people. The only problem is most Afghans are not brown. Your average green-eyed Pashtun is as pale as anyone sitting on this set right now. Essentially, they're bearded white guys. Do the dummies on cable television know that? It's possible they don't know it. From their perspective, anyone who doesn't have access to the New York City subway must be a foreigner, and all foreigners are brown. We know that. They just are. So maybe they really think that. More likely, though, they know the truth. They know that calling you a racist is the fastest way to make you obey. Do we really need millions of Afghan refugees in Phoenix, you ask? Shut up, racist! Okay, go ahead and do it. That's how the process typically works. In fact, that's pretty much how it always works with everything now. At this point, fighting racism is the universal justification for every bad idea. Tear down our statues, okay. Stop teaching math, okay. Get rid of standardized testing, all right. Defund the police, move millions of Afghan refugees to swing states to help the Democratic Party. Okay. Oppose any of it, and you're a racist. So in the end, it always happens. And in this case, it may happen. It probably will. But what happens then to us? How will this new wave of immigration affect America? Will America be a better country? Or will it be a little more like Afghanistan, which is to say, not really a better country? We can't be sure of what's going to happen. We can't see the future. But for a hint, a glimpse, maybe we ought to pay some attention to what has happened in Europe recently. They've just gone through this. So one Saturday night last month, authorities discovered the body of a 13-year-old girl next to a tree in Vienna, Austria. She had been drugged and raped and murdered. It took a few days, but by Monday, authorities announced they had arrested 2 asylum seekers from Afghanistan for the rape and murder. Shortly after that, the Chancellor of Austria identified the problem. The problem is Austria's refugee policy. Quote, I find it intolerable for people to come to us, say they are seeking protection, and then commit cruel, barbaric crimes in Austria. Yeah, but now they're getting used to it because it's been happening with increasing frequency throughout Western Europe for years now, 6 years. And every honest person knows that. Maybe the dummies on cable news don't know it, but people who live there do. Cheryl Bernard knows it. Cheryl Bernard, by the way, has been an advocate for refugees for decades. She's not against immigration. She's for it. But over time, she's concluded that the West simply is not capable, not doing a good job of successfully assimilating many Afghan refugees. Some, but many not at all. By every measure, Afghan resettlement in Europe has been an utter failure. Why is that? Maybe we should pay some attention. Afghan refugees, Bernard wrote, are notorious for barbaric attacks, attacks that left-wing politicians in Europe frequently cover up for fear of being called racist. For example, quote, and these are Bernard's words, a gang of 50 Afghans who terrorized women in the neighborhood of the Linz train station were brushed off by a government official with the remark that this was an unfortunate consequence of bad weather. End quote. You could see that happening here, by the way. In another instance, just last summer, an Afghan migrant was arrested in Germany for raping an 11-year-old girl. Authorities released him from jail in just a few days. They said he was not dangerous, and anyone who disagreed with that was a racist, of course. The migrant then proceeded to rape another girl. This time she was 13 years old. Statistics show these are not just anecdotes. It happens a lot. Ask anyone who lives there who is honest. Germany's government just conducted a study showing that rates of violent crime in Germany, those rates have been declining for years, by the way, shot up abruptly in 2015. And that was the moment when refugees from Afghanistan and Syria arrived in Germany. More than 90% of the new crimes in Germany, the German government has found, were committed by asylum seekers. More than 90%. This is not a slur. It's not slander. Those are the numbers. And it's not just a problem in Europe. Ever been to Pakistan? Here's one journalist acknowledging that it is happening in places like Iran and, yes, Pakistan as well.
You know, it's something like 2.8 million refugees in the world are Afghani refugees, basically about 1 in 10. And let's remember during the Trump years, we lowered the refugee admission to the lowest possible level that it ever had been. And also many European countries had shut their door to refugees and sent them back to places like Afghanistan. And that was before all of this happened. So I cannot even imagine what's going to take place afterwards. And countries, you know, neighboring countries like Pakistan has something like 1.4 million Afghani refugees. Iran has about 1 million. And now you're seeing a huge influx that's going to be going there as well, too. And you're talking about destabilizing those countries even further.
Looking for something different? We've got that. Book a vacation
a huge influx that's going to be going there as well, too. And you're talking about destabilizing those countries even further.
Okay. So Afghan refugees have destabilized countries into which they have moved in large numbers, but we have a moral obligation to take them anyway. Really, why is that? Why is this our unique moral burden? Isn't the U.S. government's first obligation to its own people? Isn't that the only point of having a government, to look out for its citizens? Why else have a government, actually? That might be a good question for Congressman Peter Meijer of Grand Rapids. He's a Republican, but he spent months demanding the Biden administration import as many Afghan refugees as possible. He just sent a letter to the White House, which was signed by dozens of House Republicans, saying it's just as important to evacuate American citizens as it is to accept Afghan refugees and vice versa. He also tweeted that it's, quote, beyond shameful in response to a report that the administration is, quote, prioritizing the evacuation of U.S. personnel from the country. So here you have a Republican attacking the Biden administration because they're putting American citizens before foreign nationals. And lots of other Republicans on Capitol Hill agree. And this might be a moment to pause and state the obvious. None of this is the fault of the Afghan refugees. They're desperate to leave. Nobody blames them. Most of them are probably great people. The fault is ours. It's with people like that. The idea that you can move people from one completely different country with a completely different culture and language and religion and history on the other side of the globe into our country in large numbers and everything will be just fine is insane. It doesn't work. There may be a good way to do that. Nobody has yet figured it out. And until somebody does, maybe we should pause if we care about our own people. The Biden administration, by the way, is still refusing to guarantee the safety of Americans going to the airport in Afghanistan. Joe Biden's national security advisor, that would be Jake Sullivan, the Rhodes Scholar, came out yesterday and suggested it is the fault of the Americans trapped in Afghanistan because they didn't leave sooner, even though Mark Milley and Joe Biden have been saying for weeks that the Taliban would never take over in 3 days. Couldn't happen. So instead of rescuing those Americans still stuck there, we are saving Afghans. One CNN reporter called Natasha Bertrand just reported that, in fact, we're relocating more non-citizens, Afghans, than we are Americans out of Afghanistan. About 330 U.S. citizens left Kabul yesterday, Bertrand wrote, along with, quote, about 770 non-American family members. So Joe Biden hasn't answered any questions about this. Today he walked away from reporters once again without even addressing it. Meanwhile, American citizens remain trapped. Reporter Phil Wegman from Real Clear Politics says he just got off the phone with Senator Bill Hagerty's office. Hagerty represents Tennessee. Is getting reports of Americans in safe houses near the Karzai airport who are, quote, trying to figure out when they can run for it. Run for it. That's what Americans have been left to do. Afghans are certainly doing that. Take a look at this picture of hundreds of Afghans crammed into a C-17 cargo plane. This was the air traffic controller's reaction when he saw the flight lift off.
Okay, how many people do you think are on your jet? 800 people on your jet? Holy cow.
So every one of those 800, according to Congressman Peter Meijer, who's like 33 years old, quote, risked their lives to help protect American troops. Really, Peter Meijer? How do you know that? Well, you don't know that. You're just making it up. You don't know their names, you don't know their backgrounds, you don't know squat. But he claims it anyway. Every one of those Afghans on that plane is a hero, unlike you. No need for vetting. In fact, Stephen Law wants every one of them in his neighborhood immediately. We know that because he just said so on social media. Right. But not in his neighborhood, actually. So it's pretty easy for people like Stephen Law to encourage unlimited migration of refugees because, in the end, they're not actually going to his neighborhood. They're going mostly to Republican states like Texas, where they'll be settled in places where the Democratic Party needs help. So big picture, you've got to wonder, how long will Republican voters tolerate leaders who so clearly don't care at all about them? As you may have noticed, we have problems here. We have a housing crisis, by the way, a big one. Do you have kids? Ask them. According to the Wall Street Journal, the amount of available entry-level housing in the United States, and that's defined as homes up to 1,400 square feet, is at a 5-decade low. So when the supply shrinks, the cost rises. The median value of a home in California just rose above $800,000, first time in history. Less than 40% of the millennial generation will own a home by the age of 34. They're all renting, and rent is going up too, a lot. The growth in median rent outpaced the growth in median renter income in nearly every state between 2001 and 2019. That's a disaster. That's a terrible development for American citizens. So why is it happening? Well, lots of reasons, but one reason it's happening is America's becoming a lot more crowded than it ever was. And one of the reasons for that is that we're now living through the biggest influx of refugees in American history. We are on pace for at least 2 million illegal immigrants arriving in America this year alone. That's far more than the number of asylum applicants who arrived in Europe in 2015. That was over 1 million, just over 1 million. That totally changed Europe forever. So how many of the Afghans that we accept, that Stephen Law and Peter Meyer are demanding we accept, are going to bring family members with them? Well, the vast majority, it turns out. It's not just the translators. Roughly 70% of the special immigrant visas that we have given out in recent years have gone to relatives. More than 70%. So in general, chain migration like this has been a huge driver of our population growth. It's not Americans having more children, it's chain migration. Recent data show that each new immigrant sponsored an average of 3.45 additional immigrants, getting a lot more than you thought you were. Between 2005 and 2016, 9.3 million foreign nationals were able to resettle in our country for no other reason except they had extended family members who already lived here. Oh, so it's much more than they're telling you. How many of these Afghans and their family members, you have to wonder, are excited about coming to America? It's interesting. Maybe you should ask that question. Maybe you should ask Ilhan Omar. Her position is the only reason that American citizens might object to being flooded with millions of new refugees from Afghanistan is because Americans, people who are born here and built this country, are actually mediocre and insecure. Watch.
And then you've got these crazy people on the right doing, what they always do with their fear-mongering and their hateful rhetoric. And I know what some of these people are worried about is that they're worried that refugees like myself, when they come to this country, will outshine them.
So the obvious response to that is to attack poor Ilhan Omar, but we're not going to do that. The truth is, this is our fault. She is our fault. Ilhan Omar is living proof that we are not very good at resettling refugees. She was saved from a refugee camp in Kenya as a child by the kindness and generosity of America, and yet she has grown to hate America and the people who live here. Where did she learn those attitudes? Well, of course, in college, our colleges, we taught her to hate our country. She became worse after she got here. We ought to pause before we do that again to anyone, even if they've been translators. Lara Logan is one of the very few journalists who actually knows a lot about Afghanistan. She lived there. And what might happen if we import millions of Afghans into our country? We just finished talking to her for an in-depth conversation on Tucker Carlson today, and we decided to bring you part of it tonight. Here it is.
I'm Charles Payne. I love the individual investor revolution and believe that all of us have the opportunity to use the stock market.
So tell us what you think is going on in Afghanistan now. I know it's a broad question, but give us the overview.
Well, essentially what you're looking at is the collapse of the U.S. will to continue in Afghanistan. I think what people really miss in the whole conversation is that the United States has the power to effect anything, and the Afghans know that. So what's really interesting about living on the ground with people in a country like Afghanistan is that you get to see, when you take away the prism of, political spin and parties and, all the trappings that we have that obscure the truth from us in the U.S., these people, they teach you how to look at things in their most basic form.
Yes,
right?
that is so true.
That's what they do,
yes.
And that's how they look at it. So they know, for example, the United States could bomb the Taliban supply lines right now. They're all coming from Pakistan. Everybody knows it. In fact, they're coming right through the Spin Boldak border crossing, one of the early ones that the Taliban took in the beginning of this offensive. They know that the Taliban doesn't exist without Pakistan. Right, and the Pakistani ISI. They know that the United States
ISI being the Pakistani Intelligence Service.
Right. And they know the United States funds the entire defense budget of the Pakistani military and intelligence services. So, for example, you could stop the money. You could stop the remittances of Pakistanis living in the United States. You could put sanctions. You could have visas. You know, the whole. Every time you try to address this issue, the immediate response for 20 years of this war has been, you're advocating for war in Pakistan. No, you're not. What they know is there are many things the United States could do right now to change what has happened and is happening in Afghanistan, and they're not doing it.
Wait, can I just pause? I'm asking you a series of dumb questions. Why would the U.S. government be funding the Pakistani military and its intelligence services?
You know, okay, so that's a fantastic question, and really is one for the U.S. government. But what I can tell you is that when we hear about the bureaucracy that is on Capitol Hill, which are the bureaucrats who survive from administration to administration. This has been their policy. They have pushed through the Bush administration, through Clinton, through Obama, through Trump, and now to Biden, that because Pakistan is a nuclear nation, they are the only country in that region that actually matters. In fact, Joe Biden told Afghan's president, when it was Hamid Karzai was still in power, exactly that. On his listening tour after Obama won, he said to him, we don't care about Afghanistan. And we believe that Pakistan is the most important country in that region, and they always will be. And that was that message never, ever changed. And what you're seeing in Afghanistan today is the results of that policy, because the Taliban leadership is based in Pakistan. I mean,
yes.
The Quetta Shura, the Peshawar Shura, and the Miram Shah Shura. Those are the three leadership councils that cover the entire war for the Taliban in Afghanistan. They are not just in Pakistan, they are in the loving and warm embrace of the ISI, who recruits on their behalf when, who orders Pakistanis in the tribal areas to give up their children to go and fight. They don't have a choice sometimes. And the United States has known this from day one. I mean, this is the staggering part to me, is that when you hear this debate, the intelligence agencies failed to see this. Seriously? Seriously. The NSA is known as the crown jewel of intelligence collection in the world. There isn't a digital signature in existence that they don't collect and store and analyze and have algorithms and everything else to sort through. The idea that they missed this, you know what it takes to do an invasion like this? You have to stage forces. You have to plan. You have to have meetings. You have to have, weapons that are moving in.
I'm looking at our producers. Are you listening to this?
I mean, you have to have deals.
You're making. Keep going.
I mean, it's so ridiculous. It's as ridiculous as believing that Ahmed Chalabi, some Iranian refugee in the U.S., persuaded the U.S. government to go to war. I mean, that's literally our narrative on the Iraq war.
Yes.
Seriously? I mean, we get so caught up in the weeds of this. What they want you to believe is that Afghanistan is complicated. Because if you complicate it, it's a tactic in information warfare called ambiguity increasing. So now we're all talking about the corruption and the this and the that, and there's all these complex parts. But at its heart, every single thing in the world, in your personal life, professionally, on the global stage, at its heart, it's very simple. It always comes down to one thing. One or two things. And in this case, in Afghanistan, this comes down to the fact that the United States wants this outcome. Whoever is in power right now, whoever is really pulling the strings, and I don't know that, they could do anything they want to change this, and they're not. And you see that on the southern border. You see that with critical race theory. You see that with the violations of big tech. You see it with, in 1,000 different ways, you see it all around you. And what you know from that...
You're telling the truth right now. Yeah. I can just feel, sometimes when you're listening to someone unveil an insight and you haven't tested it against anything, but you just know it's right, what you're saying is right.
It's very simple. You can have a marriage and, be thinking, should I stay with my wife, should I leave my wife? It can be very complicated. But in the end, it'll come down to one critical, defining, major thing. And everything else flows from that. And that's exactly where we're at in Afghanistan. The United States government could change this even today, and they don't do it. They don't use the leverage they have with Pakistan. They'll give you 5,000 reasons, but it doesn't matter. They don't tell you the national security threat posed by letting the cartels come across the southern border, do they? They only have a conversation about one thing, the humanitarian aspect. They never address that. Well, they're not addressing right now. You know what they're not addressing? all of the Al-Qaeda and other Islamic terrorist literature and communications that they're picking up that are celebrating this as a massive defeat. They're not talking about why the Taliban are dismantling advanced U.S. military equipment and sending it back over the border to Pakistan. And worse, they're not stopping it. Why? We are, the NSA and the National Geospatial Agency, which controls the satellites, and all of these other arms of the United States government are watching this happen in real time. They are seeing advanced U.S. military equipment going over the border into Iran and going into Pakistan, and they're doing nothing to stop it. Why not? So what the Afghans will tell you, what they will tell you is that the United States chose this outcome.
Lara Logan, amazing person, amazing conversation. She spoke to the spokesman for the Taliban, by the way, and she talks about that in the full episode. It's up on Fox Nation right now. Her series, Lara Logan Has No Agenda, is also on Fox Nation. We're going to bring you the first episode this Sunday at 10 p.m. Eastern here on the Fox News channel. So we told you about Ilhan Omar a moment ago. New evidence tonight that she actually did marry her own biological